Hey Internet, Dan Corrigan here to talk about all things bass. So, this is part 2 of my series, How It's Made, Fire Bass Tracks. If you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and check that out here. The first part is pretty much like a tutorial, it's pretty much a 20-minute tutorial on how to plug in a bass. It's kind of getting through a lot of nitty-gritty, a lot of things that a lot of people leave out in session playing, like how to get a good signal, how to have good cables, all that sort of jazz. But people often ask me, like, what do you do to come up with bass lines? Like, an artist sends you a track, how do you go from like a track with no bass to a track with bass? Like, how do you come up with these lines? So I want to walk through a couple examples, a couple tunes I've played on in the last year or so, and kind of walk through a bit of my philosophy on how I came up with bass lines for those tunes, and also like how to navigate, what you want, the artist wants, etc., etc. So being a session player means you're walking this really fine line between being a consultant and being like an automated like machine. I mean, we all have this joke about like how the Roland 808 replaced every session drummer in the world. I mean, it kind of did, but it also kind of didn't. So what I mean by this is you've been hired to fulfill the artist's vision. If you were working at a cafe and someone orders a latte, you wouldn't just hand them a cappuccino and be like, hey man, this is better than a latte, you'll like this. Like, no, you're going to give them what they asked for. At the same time, you're hired to do something the artist can't. You're bringing a wealth of knowledge about your instrument, your experience playing that instrument, your experience in certain genres and styles. They've hired you to get some of those skills and kind of get your input on how to come up with good lines. To go back to the cafe analogy, if someone ordered a latte and said, hey, this is a little bit too milky, I want something a little stronger, you might recommend to them like, hey, why don't you try a cappuccino? It'll be a little stronger, a little less milk. The reason I use cafe metaphors a lot is because, let's be real, every musician has had a day job working in the cafe at some point. So I'm hoping you'll all get it. So in this video, I'll go over kind of 3 different philosophies of bass lines you'll come up with as a session player. So you'll come up with, like written lines. So lines that like, the artist has kind of come up with ahead of time. Think of something like, you walk in the studio to record something like Billie Jean and Michael Jackson hands you a bass line and says, hey, I want you to play this. You're going to run into a lot of sort of like jammed lines. So let's say, you got a couple of rehearsals with a band, and you guys collectively come up with songs together, and as a bass player, kind of like jamming out ideas, bouncing off what the guitar player is doing, and kind of in a very organic way. And then also there's kind of more free lines, like, you get sent a track, there's no bass in it, and they just say, bass it up. Like whatever comes to your head, just throw it down, let's see where this goes. Okay, so the most straightforward part you can do is what I like to call like a pre-written part. This is most common in obviously classical, musical theater. Surprisingly, for some reason, metal, a lot of metal artists will have pre-written parts. So this is where ego can get in the way for a lot of people. There's kind of this whole like, oh, you don't trust me to come up with my own part. You feel a little divorced from your creativity, maybe. On the contrary, you got to remember the artist is still hiring you to do something that they can't. They may have written the part, but they can't, maybe necessarily play it as well as you or with the same kind of nuance. When I was in classical music school, we would all play the same pieces, like every bass player would play Botticelli, every cello player would play Bach, but we'd all interpret them differently. We'd all have our own unique style to them. I mean, you could even go and see 5 different orchestras play the same Beethoven symphony, and each one sounds completely different. Different articulations, dynamics, phrasing, and all that. So just because someone gives you a written part, don't worry, you still can add a lot of your own creativity into there. So for this example, I'm going to show you some stuff I've done with Cecile. She's someone who pre-writes a lot of her bass parts. Like I said, in metal, it's pretty common because you want the bass and guitar to lock in a certain way. You don't want to, very rarely do you see like improv in metal just because the texture is so thick that you can't really, there's not a lot of room to improvise. There's obviously exceptions. Anyway, so we're going to look at this folder here. So oftentimes with like Cecile, for example, she'll send me a folder like this one here. So if we open this up, it'll have everything in here. I'll have like bass notation, which is, all this here, looks great, looks excellent. I'll also usually get some isolated tracks, so like the bass parts in MIDI here. I might get like guitar by itself. drums by itself with click. You'll get something like that. So I'll drop these all into a DAW and go from there. And something like this MIDI track, I'll often turn into a chart. So like for a different song here, here's the chart I made for the cover we did, Reise. And yeah, you can see like, I took the MIDI, dropped it into the time I was using Finale, just wrote out some chords, put the riffs in there. That way I got like a blueprint to go off of. So now let's listen to how this song turned out. So here's the video here. So that little melodic flourish there wasn't written into the part. That's something I kind of came up with. We're playing this in rehearsal. I was like, oh, I got this cool idea here. We just have these whole notes. Why don't I spice it up a bit? And Cecile loved it. I know she loves slides on the bass, so that sounded great as going on. That's another good point. Just because you're playing a written part doesn't mean you can't suggest things to add or whatever. Oftentimes people send me a written part where the rhythms clash a lot with what the kick drum's doing or get muddy with what the guitar is doing. And I'll suggest, I'll be like, hey, this is getting a little muddy with the guitars. Could we try something more like this? Oftentimes the artist is like, yeah, like let's go for that. So there's a time and place for that. That being said, you got to be kind of selective where you do that, especially if, you're paying for rehearsal space, studio time. That can be really expensive. You're paying by the minute, There's times to bite your tongue and say, like, you know what, this is good enough. And there's times to really bite down and be like, hey, this is something we got to work on, something we got to fix. Pick apart every single riff and be like, hey, I had a cool idea here. I had a cool idea there. I had a cool idea here. Because you're just going to start eating up studio time. And, when you're on the clock, you don't want to be doing that. Yeah, so the rest of the tune I just followed was in the chart. The only exception is when I got to the bridge. So there are the double kicks doing the. So I decided once again to line, like I said, if it's not lined up with the drums. Originally I was doing a bump 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 bump. Here I wanted to add that. So I started adding 16ths with the kick instead of just doing the eighth notes that I've been doing the whole time. So little stuff like that you can change, you can add. Don't be afraid to consult with the artist and be like, hey, here's some ideas I have, might spice this up a bit, might work a little better. Remember, you're the bass player, you got some expertise there. They might not have that oversight. So a lot of people think that playing a pre-written part is boring or it takes the fun out of it. On the contrary, I quite like this style of playing. It takes a lot of pressure off of me, the bass player, to have to come up with something really great in the moment. You have a foundation to go off of. Like I said, you could tweak it a little bit, add a bit of your own flair in there, tidy it up, make it fit a little better. But you really get to lock in and really focus on the performance of the part instead of having to worry about the writing and the performance. Oftentimes we can end up in the studio and we're kind of unsure about what ideas we want to put in there, what kind of lines to play, what feels to go for. And sometimes that gets in the way of being able to focus on playing really well, getting great articulation, great tone, because we're so wrapped up in, should I add a run here? Should I play the 16th, 8th notes, whatever, Okay, so the next kind of bass line that you might have to come up with is kind of like what I call a jammed bass line. So this is either you show up at the session, you jam out the song with the musicians there and kind of come up with your parts on the spot, or maybe you have a rehearsal beforehand where you all get together and come up with stuff, or maybe you have a writing session where you and the artist sit down and write a song together, and part of that is coming up with key hooks and parts, bass lines, stuff like that. This is where it could get a little bit muddy as to who did what, who came up with what. I mean, music copyright's a whole nother rabbit hole that deserves its own video. But in this case, take a song like So What by Miles Davis, right? People often argue about who came up with the iconic bass line. Was it Ron on the bass? Was it Miles? I mean, he wrote the song. Did he write the bass line? Was it something that Bill Evans came up with? Jimmy Cobb, the drummer? I mean, sometimes drummers write music. Who knows? The reality is it's probably a combination of all four of them. Anytime I've gone to a session like this, writing session, jam session, oftentimes, you start off playing a line, someone suggests things to add to it. People might show you something like a guitar player might pick up and be like, hey, can you play something kind of like this, but a little different? It's a lot of gray areas to who's coming up with what here. You know what I'm saying? So here's a song I recorded with Richard Garvey. So we had a prearranged rehearsal session where we came up with this tune. Richard had come up with the chord progression, some melody and lyrics. We went over to Steve's got a great studio at Frederick Audio in Kitchener. So we were sitting there, we jammed it out. Richard started playing this kind of like offbeat guitar thing. Steve laid down a little train beat, and I started vibing out with some bass lines. So this is what they were playing. So this is where, a bit of improv comes in and figuring out, what kind of line do you want to play here? Like, obviously I could have done something wild like this. I mean, technically, I'm following the chord progression, C, E to G. I'm playing kind of the right notes, but you can tell that really doesn't fit the song, So what I ended up doing is I started to think about the style, what style are they going for? What sort of feelings are they trying to invoke? Clearly, it's a very country style song. It's got this, listen to this drum beat. That's a train beat. That's a very country style beat. Listen to the guitar by itself. Kind of like a lot of like oompa oompa kind of thing, almost like a polka. So I started thinking about what sort of bass lines would be idiomatic of this style, and I thought, a roots fifth bass line, a very common country thing. So I started building the bass line like that. And then we ended up deciding that we wanted to add a little bit more life to the song. That bass line was good, it works, but we wanted to add something with a little more pep. So we started throwing in some passing tones. So to explain what I ended up doing, root, fifth, root, and then going to eighth notes, doing a little passing tone from the C, D to the E flat. So, starting from the C, throwing in some passing tones, and changing the rhythm bit, throwing that like bum 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 bum. Throwing in a bit of eighth notes, adding a little bit more pep to the bass line, adding a little bit more motion to it. So I end up coming with a bass line that sound like this. Drives the song just a little bit more, and that's the bass line we ended up going with. Now, a couple months later, we're all recording remotely. I got sent these stems that we're looking at now, and when I went to record, originally I jammed the song on electric just because that's what I had on me that day. But being an upright player, I felt like this song really called for an upright bass. So once again, when switching instruments, you're going to play things a little bit differently. I'm going to throw in a few more open notes on the upright to check my tuning. I might phrase things a little bit differently. Like the notes speak a lot different. They take a lot longer to open up. So this is the bass line I ended up playing on the upright. You can listen to it. So you can hear I'm kind of like playing a little bit more behind the beat, giving it a little bit more of like a like a lumbering feel. Yeah, so that's an important thing to consider too, is different instruments will bring different vibes to a song as well, you know? So overall, like I said, this style of recording, very common. I mean, it's the industry standard in places like Nashville. Like I said, the Nashville 5 and 3, 5 songs, 3 hours is a pretty big industry standard. You know, this song, we had some rehearsal time to put it together. Richard was able to spend a good amount of time on pre-production before I even got the stems. Other times, like this song you're hearing here, you know, I recorded at OE Art Studios, met the guy for the first time in the studio. You know, 5 hours, recorded 4 songs. You know, that is what it is too, right? Now for this, you have to be a good improviser. And by that, I don't mean you have to learn how to play like tritone substitutions over Coltrane changes, you know, or anything fancy like that. What it does mean is that you have to quickly come up with very stylistic lines that, you know, latch onto key melodic hooks, rhythmic ideas that you're hearing. You know, people always talk about locking in, you know, the bass and the kick drum is a pretty big thing, you know, hitting shots with the rest of the band. All these things are very important. You know, you might want to double a certain guitar rhythm or guitar riff. You know, you might want to even go along with what the vocalist is doing. These are the kind of things you have to very quickly be able to pick up on when you're coming up with lines, you know. So this last type of part is kind of like what I call like free range parts, you know, kind of like free range chickens, but for bass players. This is where the artist or producer gives you something very minimal to work with and kind of expect you to do most of the creative work in coming up with the line. You know, classic example of this is Bust a Move by Flea, right? At least according to Flea, he said that, you know, it was just him, the producer, and the drum machine sitting in a room, and he just whipped that tune out, that iconic bass line, no direction whatsoever. So here we got a tune that I recorded with a DJ from Nova Scotia here. The song's called Cecile. All I got was, as you can see here, it says 90 BPM. I didn't even get a key. So let's take a quick listen to what I got here. Quick little piano chord off the top. So you hear a very static harmony most of the time. Blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of the phrase is a little ba 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 ba, a little bit more movement there. So it's really, originally I was hearing that 16th, I was starting the tick-a-tick-a-tick-a-tick-a-tick that's common in a lot of like R&B and hip hop, neo soul music. I really wanted to highlight that, you know, coming up with something that really bounced off of that rhythm and brought it back together at the end of the phrase. So this is the original bass line I came up with. Bum, 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 bum. Da, 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 da. You know, all that da 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 da, like really accenting, you know, hey, there's swung 16ths here, da da da, going on over and over again, bringing it back at the end. There was something a little more melodic. Now, this is the case. You know, I sent it off to the producer, and he said, yeah, you know, sounds great and all. Sounds a little bit too busy though. I'd like something a little bit more simplistic, something a little less busy, you know? So I went with something still syncopated, still playing off the beat. This time I added some fifths to add a little bit of tension harmonically, you know, going a fifth down. And this is the second part I came up with. Same intro. So this is where you as a bass player got so much control. You know, that's already so much more laid back. Like if we listen to them back and back. Easy, laid back. More like, yeah, get going at the club, woo. You know, a lot more chaotic energy in that first one than the second one that's just smooth. Especially bring it down in the mix a little bit. You know, it has a very like lo-fi study beats kind of vibe to it. You know, I'm finding more and more these days. I mean, obviously, through the course of quarantine, remote sessions have become a lot more popular. They're still very popular. You know, being able to work with people from all over the place is a huge advantage. And this kind of playing is becoming more and more common, where people are like bouncing songs in circles, like, hey, here's my part, bounce it off to the next person, bounce it off to the next person. You know, I just finished playing a tune on Dumbpop's new EP, you know, and that was an EP that featured, you know, musicians from Montreal. Myself was in Ottawa at the time. I'm in Montreal now. You know, he's based in Vancouver. He had a bass player in Japan who played in the track. You know, that's obviously not possible. You can't put all those people in a room together and have them work. You know, the plane tickets alone would be more than the song's worth. You know, sometimes another tip I got is to even send a couple of versions off, you know, at first glance. You know, oftentimes I'll send a electric version and an upright version, kind of see what the artist likes, or I might just record two versions off the bat like this, you know, a busier one, a simpler one, and be like, hey, what's fitting your vibe a little more. And like I said, as a bass player, you got so much control over the harmony, the feel, the melody. Remember that. Remember that you have a lot of control of what direction the song takes, and own that. Work with that. So there you go. That's a bit of insight into how I come up with session bass parts. Obviously, like you can see, there's so many different styles, so many different approaches. So that's kind of like the three main categories I lump group stuff into, you know, parts that are written, parts that are kind of jammed out, and parts that are really more free for interpretation. But I'd love to know what you guys think. If you're getting into session playing, if you're a session player yourself, what are some of your approaches? You know, what have you noticed? What sort of broad statements have you been able to say about the stuff that you've worked on? You know, if you're an aspiring session player, you know, what else would you love to know about the art, about how I do this? What sort of things do you want to know in terms of theory or, you know, gear or whatnot? You know, leave it down in the comments. I'd love to answer your questions. And until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Okay, so my hair is a mess.